Very good. So we're ready to go. Okay. I'll just start this again about the cell cycle, and we'll go from there. And then we're relatively done with this, so I can. Then and I know most of this is certainly review material for you, and I'll have more information. And we'll really, I just wanted to maybe have enough time to at least introduce the start of muscle physiology, which, because really the next 2 units after this are really the critical point for this first portion of the class. And so here, and you've had this 1,000 times. Look, I've said to you before, and I will continue to make the point. To me, a lot of this, from context as you get older, are things that lead to cancerous changes. Okay, and it's I pray that this doesn't touch any of you. Really, it's that kind of a thing that changes everything. But this is where the cell cycle is, and the idea of biological cycles is most of the time what our body does is we govern them. Okay, we would normally have a heartbeat more rapid than 100, yet the action of our autonomic nervous system is to hold that in check. And so the healthier you are, the more that's held in check. And healthy individuals generally have a resting heart rate between 60 and 80. And even healthier individuals may even be below 60, just sitting there resting, doing what you're doing. It's a very good measure of overall health. That's done very, very quickly. We get to that in the heart unit. But the cell cycle is not unlike that. The cell cycle is such that it needs to be understood that the governance of it is when it's not governed. Effectively, what happens, it becomes more rapid than it should, whatever the amount of replication for that particular tissue is. So if it's very, very rapidly replicating tissue, like the gastrointestinal lining, which we replace in its entirety every 3 to 6 days, billions of cells on a daily basis, then it's being held in check, but still very rapid. If it loses those controls, it's going to make such rapid turnover that inevitably, think of anything you do too rapidly, you're much more likely to make mistakes. And when the mistakes involve making the incorrect DNA or having the DNA altered or the incorrect complementary base pairing, now you have the definition of a mutation, an error in DNA. And your immune system can only cope with so many of these. You have measures that are able to destroy those cells. You have measures that are able to destroy those cells before they become widespread and they're identified. Okay, but unfortunately, the ones that are very severe can change their identity very, very rapidly. And at that point, your immunological system can't overwhelm it. So as I say all the time, it's a numbers game. And so that to me is the background part of this cell cycle. And we have controls. I talked about them a little bit for the handful of us here who are an MCAT. And just to reiterate the point, we have two real genetic controls that deal with this. And one is that we have things called proto-oncogenes that are inherent, and they act as governance. Okay, and when we were doing in the context of a virus being an oncogenic virus, being able to create a tumor, it damages those controls and it allows the cell cycle to accelerate. The flip of that are the brakes. And you have another mechanism that holds back the cell cycle. They're called tumor suppressor genes, and they're your brakes. But what happens when those brakes are mutated by whatever means, although the context again we were using was viral, is now you don't have any brakes. And then the worst possibility, imagine if you have an accelerator that's stuck to the floor and you don't have any brakes. Then something terrible is going to happen. So therein lies the introductory phase. So the first idea, and it's such a misconception, when we were kids in school, this is how it was presented to us. They knew about interphase and mitosis, not all the nuances. Okay, and they drew that. I love it. I have to draw it. I feel compelled. That picture of the cell, which doesn't look like it all. This is a cell, everybody. It's got a nucleus in the middle, and it was something like a biological rectangle that was sitting in there. And so when it's an interphase, It's resting. And it's busy when it's replicating. Nothing could be further than the truth. It's busiest when it's an interface. That's when not only is it doing business, it's getting ready to replicate. Hey, I got to replicate today. Well, I have to. But what about your day job? I got to do that too. Can't have a cell. So we'll look at that. That's my take on. I love the cell cycle. Okay. So when the cell carries out its routine, depending on how routine you think that cell is, and prepares. And so how do we identify it? We see chromatin, not chromosomes. Why do we see chromatin? Because it's otherwise engaged with those regulatory proteins we call histones, right? Okay. To me, DNA's natural tendency is to supercoil. What do the histones do? They stretch it out. It's like you took your slinky and you put stuff when you were a little kid. Slinky, you know. You guys know what a slinky is.
Yeah.
How dare you? Ours were metal, not plastic. That's a, don't laugh. Metal slinkies. They weren't made in China. So it appears to be chromatin, I beg your pardon. We have the classic phases. G1, truly the most important phase, I think, because that's when the growth is most vigorous. That's when it's replicating all the materials necessary to duplicate. And when it has reached its absolute level, if it is capable of doing so, of high differentiation, and read that as nerve cells, muscle cells, nerve cells, smooth cardiac and skeletal muscle cells. At that point, it will exit the cell cycle and it's said to be in G0. Okay. So what happens? We produce waste products that you're aware of. The waste products that are byproducts of doing all of this growth and metabolism collectively, because they're related to the cell cycle, we call them cyclins. They accumulate in sufficient amount that they bond to other enzymes that are manufactured, which we call cyclin-dependent kinases. Complex, you get a cyclin and CDK or cyclin-dependent kinase. And you'll see that obviously as the slides go on. And effectively, when it reaches whatever its critical mass is, so to speak, it releases that restriction point. It releases that lock. Just like you go back and mentally think about the lac operon that you all learned about. It pulls that little safety pin, and then all of a sudden, that next phase of the cell, it proceeds on to S phase. And why is S phase so critical? Because that's where mutations occur. That's dedicated to the assembly of the new DNA, the replication of the DNA that occurs. So that's where it doesn't preclude mutations occurring later, but that's really where we see it. And then when all that is said and done, we have yet another restriction point, although less important, that G2/M restriction point, because it allows it to complete G2 and proceed on to M, or mitotic phase. And at that point, okay, we have another set of cyclins that develop. Think of it internally as metabolic mechanisms, and the waste products they're producing are based on whether everything is in place. And indeed, that's one of those areas where you may encounter a sufficient error as one of our internal safeguards. And again, when those internal safeguards are activated, what does the cell do? It undergoes apoptosis, autolysis, whatever you want to call it. So, something triggers the release probably of internal lysosomes, that like suicide pack, if you want to call it that, and out it goes, see you later. So it's a useful control. And again, we only have a limited capability with those controls. Once it completes it, then it's going to go on into something that's relatively straightforward, and those are the mitotic phases. And so you can see the cycle that's here and all the events that go on. After it passes that checkpoint at the end of G2, you get, and again, mitosis by definition, I don't know why students mess this up. Nuclear division, and it's always a trick question, cytokinesis is cell division. Okay. all the major events. You already know these. I don't really care whether it's early prophase or late prophase. Maybe that's a cell and molec or a genetics question. It's not for me. Okay. Earl Grey. That is the drink of Captain Jean-Luc Picard. Enterprise. Earl Grey, hot. Live long and prosper. And the response is prosperity and long life. For those who haven't had me before, my eldest naval captain and I used to go to Star Trek conventions in constant. I had the pointy ears. I could have saved him for like Lord of the Rings. You guys are no fun. 4 events of prophase. Chromosomes appear, histones let go, nuclear membrane disappears, nucleolus disappears, spindle starts to form. They are all reversed in telophase. Metaphase, line up in the middle, equatorial plate, all that good stuff. The sort of clothesline effect, pulling them apart at the centromere. The shortest of all the phases, anaphase, and very often we'll begin toward the latter portion of anaphase, start to see the cytokinesis effect, even as it begins to demonstrate itself as the chromosomes are migrating, and telophase, again, just a reversal. What happens, then you have those tiny actin filaments effectively developing that cleavage zone. That's there. My analogy, like you have a balloon you're making into a puppet, you're twisting it. Am I the only one? Wait till your parents and your kids. I'm going to do balloon puppets for the kids. You're awful. Yeah, I'm not doing forks and bubbles. You've done that's not my area of expertise. DNA polymerase, all that. Hey, cell and molecular genetics, right? You had that stuff. Forks and bubbles. Good, good, good. Spliceosomes. We know what semi-conservative replication is. Okay, and that generally prevents the deterioration. We know about anti-parallel. Okay, we know about leading strands and lagging strands. And I never know which is which, but you should know that. I would suspect. I'm not going to ask you about it because it's not in this clip. That Ozaki versus Okazaki. Unless they're on Iron Chef, the original Iron Chef, I don't know. I have an Iron Chef. Not doing that. Yeah. Control. Here's the kinesis, cytokinesis. Yeah, all the stuff that goes on in the phases. Cleavage furrow, that whole thing. I'm not big on the distinction between plants and not. I am big on these kinds of things. Surface to volume ratio. There's such a significant control. Obviously, cells, even if they're expanding, there's a certain point where that the volume is too extensive, and that's why the surface is so significant, as you already know. Various kinds of factors that's certainly impactful, and we'll get to that in endocrine. And the stop signals, contact inhibition, which is lost. In cancer cells, they lose all of those things. They become there's anything that could inhibit it. Any of the cyclical elements are either overwhelmed or absent. And that becomes the problem. When you see, if you get the opportunity for those going into medical fields, when you see a cancer, you know it's a cancer. I mean, they're really bad looking. They're things that look irregular. And frequently, they don't have that degree of encapsulation, where you can see the distinction between normal and abnormal tissue. That's such a critical area. I showed you that a little bit before about biopsies and things like that, how you do those things. So they really are. And I was fortunate. I had a few suspicious, but I never had one in any of my biopsies that was truly cancerous. I had So nevus, it was a kind. Nevus is a pigmented lesion, and this gal, she came to me because she was upset because she went to another doctor, and the doctor made her, it was on her foot or her leg when I saw it, and the doctor did nothing wrong, but he had her remove all of her clothes, and the appropriate treatment for this, what's called a junctional nevus, is to inspect all of the skin for other lesions. So she was distressed by that, and she goes, "Why do you do this?" And I ascertained that that was absolutely the appropriate thing. I don't think he explained it to her, but he should have. And that was a long time ago. We're talking about 40 years ago, so you can imagine. I mean, would probably be an uproar, notable things today. But and then I sent the report that she gave me to the smartest guy I know, who I've told you about, who's a Sloan Kettering oncologist, who was my mom's best friend's son, the elder of two boys, and so now I'm probably close to retirement, and basically told me about this. So it's very interesting that this was a precancerous lesion. So you don't see a lot of those things that are there. Here's the kinases, checkpoints, and this I'm not doing. Exons, introns, all those the sites and all that stuff. I'm not doing it. Okay, not this is not this class. I know they put it in here, but again, we use this for anatomy and physiology, and even for my entry level nursing students, A&P, we don't do this. I do. If somebody does it, it's up to them. Codons and I mean, obviously, I pay attention. We always see this illustration with I mean, to me, that's the beauty when we get into for immunology or when you get into the immune system. That's how we make so many antibiotics so quickly. Is basically you have multiple sites on a given strand that you're able to generate replication. So when we get into the immune system and you see what happens when we get into the secondary phase, it's really fascinating. Nice pictures. Yeah, yeah. And then the apoptosis nugget, that's fine. And again, to me, that's not to me that's more in the cell molecular genetics basis than anything else. And finally, get into stuff that I know about. Muscles. The good stuff begins to me. So, for those who had the anatomy part, or for those that didn't, the muscle is basically the muscle unit that we do is basically name that muscle and the major muscle groups and some bases. Now, I don't pay. I'm not really into that as much. For whatever reason, I find it to be maybe the least interesting thing. Okay, but this, how muscles work, because this not only does it give you an understanding of how muscles work, but it's also an introduction how nerves work. So it's all about the neuromuscular. Really, it boils down to the events that occur at coming to and then after the events at what's called the neuromuscular junction. And this is one of the more difficult areas of physiology, I think, to understand. So you're going to get sick of voltage gated channels and ligand gated channels and voltage gated channels and sodium potassium pumps and more voltage gated channels. All that's here. Thankfully, in this particular textbook, the animations are very high quality that underscore those. They're like that one we saw with the resting membrane potential. I like those. Okay, and it's all about energy transformations. So we're going to see these events. Basically, it boils down to, after we get through this initial stuff, the events that occur leading to and up to the neuromuscular junction. Then the really significant area called excitation, contraction, coupling. How basically we transduce. So we change electrical energy into mechanical energy. And finally, what happens with that mechanical energy called the cross bridge cycle. Those are the three major clusters of events that to some extent overlap. And most authors put together sort of the way that they look at those things. There's a lot of events. So when I do it in AP1 with intro-level nursing students, we do it intro-level nursing students done. When I do it for you, It's a little more complex. Don't thank me. Just those looks on your faces is enough. Okay. I'm so happy it's Friday. And we even it's okay. You guys are killing me. Okay, half of the body's mass, muscles, average. That's there. Really the introduction to energy transduction. And now you're going to see one again, that point I mentioned before. Electrical events, then chemical events, then mechanical events. Electrical events always precede either chemical and or mechanical events. So you will see that again and again as a recurrent feature. So we look at the types of muscle tissues, their characteristics. So we have to do a little bit of microanatomy and physiology. That's there. Terminology wise. So you're going to see that we use myo and mes typically for more macroscopic. And when we get down to the individual, and this is really much dedicated almost entirely to skeletal muscle, this part. In the latter portion of this sequence, we look at a cardiac, which I do much more extensively in the heart unit, and smooth muscle. But sarco is very much when we get to this very interesting, unique kind of cell called the skeletal muscle cell, which is one of these highly differentiated multicellular units. So it's a confluence. It's like a collective group of cells that have formed one mass that we classically call. So terminology is important, and terminology from a test taking standpoint is important because cells are also called fibers. And the cells are filled with flexible rods, which we call fibrils. And those fibrils are filled with additional flexible rods we call filaments. So it's easy to get confused when you see the term fiber, filament, or fibril. So, that's where the terminology comes from. So sarcoplasm, we don't say cytoplasm in a skeletal muscle cell, we say sarcoplasm. We don't say endoplasmic reticulum, we say sarcoplasmic reticulum. The plasma membrane is the sarcolemma. And there's different things that occur in modifications of each of those structures. So skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. The first part of this is all dedicated to skeletal. So until we get to cardiac and smooth, we're only talking about skeletal. Cardiac and smooth are different because they're involuntary. We do not control them. Can we manifest control over them? Yes, in the sense that can you lower your heart rate by meditating? Yes. Can we impact it with medications? Absolutely. But we can't. Not that I know of a way to say, oh, you're going at 85. I want you to take the heart rate down to 78. Okay, got that. Can't do that. But I can go. We have a drink. That's voluntary versus involuntary. You're going to see striations. This has to do with alternating bands of thick and thin, but really of the filaments themselves, which are alternatingly thick and thin. Where they overlap, the light doesn't get through, so they appear dark. And so they look like stripes, or what we call striations. So you're going to see that we have visible striations in skeletal and cardiac. The implication to me in that is strength. We don't see those striations. That's why we call them smooth muscle. The overlap is there, but it's just not as extensive. You have a lot more of these thinner fibers than thicker fibers. It's about 2-to-1 thin to thick in skeletal and cardiac. So you get a lot of visible overlapping. In smooth, about 12 or 13 to 1. So they mistakenly do this in textbooks saying there are no stripes. There are stripes, you can't see them. Okay. So skeletal and smooth muscle cells are elongated and referred to as muscle fibers. The cardiac's a different shape. And we do that more in the heart. Packaged and skeletal muscles, how do they attach? They attach And you'll see that directly and indirectly it'll be coming up. Directly, right into bone, right into a structure. So anatomically, bone, certainly the most common, but also into dense bands of connective tissue that you might remember from anatomy called aponeuroses. Those are things like the plantar fascia, the ligamentum nuchae, the ligamentum alba, okay, the linea alba, where your abdominal muscles. For those of you, mine's not visible, the six pack. My six pack's in the refrigerator. Yingling, which I use for cooking. I have a great Instant Pot recipe for chili. Use like a cup of beer. I don't want it to go to waste, so if you're going to use a beer, you might as well use something that tastes good. Okay. And they had it at Sheets, so I could get it. Okay, moving on. So striations, skeletal muscle fibers are long. They can be a foot long. Voluntary, conscious control, contract rapidly, tire easily, very strong. Skeletal striated voluntary works cardiac, only the heart. The heart is mostly cardiac muscle, as you probably remember. We do see the striations, but they're involuntary. That has to do with the internal conduction system. We spend a lot of time on this. And smooth, hollow organs are everywhere in physiology. Circulatory system, hollow organs. Genitourinary, hollow organs. Respiratory, hollow organs. Hollow organs, digestive, hollow organs. So we see a ton of smooth muscles, big player. Striates, they're not visible, they should say, not visibly striated, involuntary. And you get to look at the pictures. Very distinctive microscopically, and we don't do the microscopic stuff for skeletal. Cardiac, you'll see the branching, which makes them unique. Multinucleated here, typically single or multinucleated. Spindle shape. Interesting. Characteristics, excitable, meaning they can respond to stimuli. This is the whole idea of the resting membrane potential. Excitability and what it produces, contractility, has to do with its being able to respond to stimuli. And we will see it is the rapid inflow and outflow of cations, principally sodium and potassium. Calcium playing a role as well, certainly. They're stretchy, okay? And they can recoil. You're going to see one of the proteins, the way that it is represented in illustration and the way that it appears to be arranged is almost like a spring. Okay. So it has a certain inherent elasticity. And again, and what happens, not that you guys would know this yet, this may surprise you, you're not quite as flexible as you get older. Just putting it. Like I'm embarrassed at the golf course. For somebody who used to hit the ball 250 yards, now that's two good swats for me. It's a 150-yard par three. I'm hitting driver. I'm not the only old guy who does that. My son's best friend drove the 10th hole at the old course at St. Andrews. I was there. 312 yards.
That's the one with the bridge, right? You walk across.
No, that's the Swilken Bridge. That's the 18th. He nearly drove that.
Oh, okay.
The 10th is way out. It's the farthest where they have like it's like the holes all over up the kind of crisscross. So you got to duck and things like that. And the 10th is up at 9 and 10 are as far out as you can go. You really can appreciate that the North Sea is pretty close. But there's two other courses in the interior. Is the old course, and then they have the new course, which is about 150 years old. And then they built another course called the Jubilee course, which goes all the way out and really overlooks nursing. We played all three of those.
Nice.
And I've never seen people consume that much alcohol in a 3-day span. No, I'm confident that some of you could challenge them. Just confident. My my fiance, oh, not my wife then, nearly dumped me. Okay. Responsible for all locomotion, I'll buy that. All that stuff. Walking, digesting, posture, yeah. Stabilization, yeah. Generate heat as they contract, you shiver. Everything has to do with nerve and blood supply, the sheathing, which is what we're going to get to. You saw some of this anatomically. We're going to go over it again. And again, the difference between direct and indirect attachments. So you're going to see indirect is going to be where there's a tendon. Not all muscles have tendons. Okay. It doesn't make tendons less important, but not all muscles have tendons. So they have what's called a neurovascular bundle. We're going to use that term a lot as our time together goes on. And so they are really important. Okay? The ability for any healing to ensue, even though muscles really don't heal particularly well, is based on what we used to call the tropho means growth, regulatory mechanism. So the neurovascular bundle has to be intact. So you're going to see the elaborate branching of these nerves plays a pivotal role because along the individual fiber, which is the cell, and this cell could be a foot long. Imagine that. And it's even longer when we get to nerves. That individual fiber has attachments called motor units. And so you're going to see the branching becomes really significant with regard to that. Contracting requires a tremendous amount of oxygen and nutrients and waste product removal. A lot. And we get into this when we talk about the metabolism. And it's really what causes fatigue, pain, spasms, has a lot to do with waste products. A lot to do with waste products. Okay. There are layers of connective tissue that get, as you go from outside, very, very thick and firm. And as you work your way inside, less so. Until finally, around these literally probably millions, thousands easily, of individual fibers, okay, they're loose areolar connective tissue. They're very delicate. Food analogies are coming. Get excited. Okay, so mesium, epi for outside. We're going to see this recurrent pattern all the time. You saw it in anatomy. So here you're going to see epimesium. When we get to nerves, you're going to see epinurium. Epimesium, dense, irregular connective tissue. Muscles are bound and held together by shape. We call that epimesium a kind of fascia. It blends anatomically with something called deep fascia. That's the material that literally bonds to the muscle and then holds the muscle tightly to bone for mechanical advantage. In surgery, we look at fascial planes for divides. Fascia is extraordinarily tough. You have what's called superficial fascia. That's, you see in surgery when you make an incision and the incision's right, the skin will split apart fairly easily. That goes down to superficial fascia, the fatty layer. So you've gone through the epidermis and the dermis, and it naturally splits. It's a phenomenon. It's really nice when you have just the right incision depth. And then deep fascia is really the next big layer that comes around, and you see that, and it's because we work in layers. Because in between those layers, there's stuff that you can hurt a lot. That's there. Perimesium is a dense, but not nearly as dense connective tissue surrounding the individual bundles. Just like in nerves, you're going to see they're called fascicles. And they give a very distinctive pattern cross-sectionally. And then within those fascicles are really the analogy, and you see the same thing in nerves. You have loose, fine areolar connective tissue around the individual fibers called endomysium. And then underneath that is when you're going to see the exterior of the sarcolemma, which is the plasma membrane of the individual fiber. And you'll see it, and it's very good. So they're taking a look, let's say this is a gluteal muscle, or probably a hamstring muscle. The epimysium, sometimes you call it silver skin. If you get a big chunk of, for you carnivores, you're non-vegetarians, and I'm a vegetarian fan, a vegan fan. I cook for vegans and vegetarians. That's the silver skin. You often have to remove that for things to cook. If you're making a brisket, you got to do that. Where I come from, we made a lot of briskets. New, and why not? Okay. So, and what will happen is the epimysium blends with, it's like the periosteum blending with the capsule. If you remember that from bone anatomy, the epimysium blends with the tendon, and the tendon inserts into bone very, very tautly, very tightly. You remember my thing with Sharpie's fibers, how it's sewn into bone? The analogy I told you about when we operate on those things. That's why I know about this stuff. This is the pattern. So where do you see this pattern or that pattern? When you go to the grocery store, because when they butcher the meat and they're sitting there and making packages, they're cutting them cross-sectionally. So that's how you're able to identify certain cuts of steaks that are there. So it's based on the number of fascicles. So another way we describe the fascicles, particularly, is the marbling pattern, because how fatty it is gives you an idea, and sort of the classifications between prime and choice and Wagyu, American style Kobe beef. I'm having a food moment. And so now we get to the end. Now, if we pull out a fascicle, what's it filled with? Individual bundles, easy for me to say, of muscle fibers. And what are the muscle fibers filled with? Individual bundles of fibrils. And when we're going to go further and pull out the fibrils and look at them on their sides, and we're going to see the repeat unit. And now this is all about repeat units called the sarcomere. And if we understand what goes on in one sarcomere, we understand what goes on in every sarcomere. So it's really I'd like to say a well understood process, and I think it is. I mean, that's the good news. We understand it. We know how it works. The bad news is this is so highly developed. When you tear a muscle, you're not going to make, you don't make any more muscle. You can make your muscle thicker and bigger, but you can't make more. You can hypertrophy or hypotrophy, but you cannot hyperplasia. You can't make more cells. You got them, so you have to do the best you can with them. For most of it, doesn't matter if we have a tiny tear in a muscle. Understand why it's a performance. World-class athletes different. I mean, the reason why Lynn Swan's in the Hall of Fame when he was great, when he was healthy, it was unbelievable. Okay, his hamstring would every year would tear. Eventually, the thing that made him, national champion in the long jump wasn't there anymore. All those catches. I love Steeler analogies. He used to call my uncle by his first name. Hey, Eddie, how you doing? I talked about this a little bit in anatomy. I think it's passé to talk about origins and insertions, because origin was the fixed point and insertion was the mobile point. But depending on the activity, it doesn't matter. So in sport, and that's really my context, we talk about attachments. And then you can figure out what it is and direct. The epimysium fused to the periosteum or the bone, or it doesn't really fuse to the cartilage. I don't know where they got that. I give up. Maybe in the ribs, I might loosely agree with that. Indirect, extend beyond tendon or sheet-like aponeuroses. Same illustration. Same. This is the pullout. So our way of understanding how they work comes from here. We're going to look at the epimysium. We're going to pull out a fascicle. Now we're going to take that fascicle. We're going to pull out the fiber, the individual muscle cell. Now we're going to come back and we're going to look at the fiber, see the endomysium, loose areolar connective tissue, see the nuclei, multiple, and then we're going to pull out the individual components, these flexible rods called myofibrils, and then you started to see that banding pattern, that alternating dark and light. You can see it here, the striations. You're seeing it here. You don't really see it so much there. So long cylindrical cells, multiple nuclei, muscle fiber, plasma membrane, sarcolemma is the new name. Sarcoplasm. The sarcoplasm is, it's still cytoplasm, but it has a fair amount of pigmentation. That pigmentation comes from something that's similar, but certainly not identical to hemoglobin, but it's an iron containing compound, and it does impart the degree of redness that you see. So when you talk about red meat versus white meat, it's a function of how much myoglobin is. Okay. We're all red meat, as my associate Dr. Lecter says. Okay. Do you know in my other class, these two girls are sisters, and their dad, who's retired, was a cop here in Moon. He was an extra in Silence of the Lambs. He met Dr. Lecter. It's my favorite Dr. Lecter story with Clarice. You old guys are Silence of the Lambs engaged. Mm-hmm. Okay. When I first started teaching, I was going to do tutoring to supplement my income back in '98 at La Roche. The lady who was in charge was a sister, Sister Clarice. It took every fiber of my very, very limited self-control not to go, why, hello, Clarice.
Good thing you didn't. They would probably think you were, Yep.
I'm having an old nun for dinner. Red wine and ice candy. Oh, I have to get that in. If I'm not having a good time, why would you? Okay. So myoglobin, degree of redness, oxygen supply, oxygen curve is different, by the way, everybody. So the oxygen is released a little bit more quickly than by way of our hemoglobin. If anything, fetal hemoglobin is a little bit more like myoglobin. Just so because you don't have to really know it. I'm just telling you that, particularly for you MCAT guys, because there's a nugget like that in the MCATs on our prep stuff. And all right, glycosomes, because the energy is glycogen. I say it all the time. Only two places where we store glycogen: liver, skeletal muscle. They're about fight or flight, which is a unit we do in this class, the autonomic nervous system, super important. And that's our emergency energy supply. Fight or flight, we have to run or fight, and you need to have immediate available energy: liver, skeletal muscle, period. Other than that, the only way we can store complex carbohydrates is in adipose tissue. The organelles are the fibrils, which we're going to explore, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is very interesting, and something that's really unique at transmitting the signal called T, which stands for transverse tubules. And they're all big players in this. So more coming, just a little bit more. Myofibrils, rods, thousands in a single fiber, millions in a muscle. 80% of the volume. Striations, you'll see because of the overlapping, which you're going to see shortly. Sarcomeres, these individual repeat units. That's the functional unit of muscle, the sarcomere. You understand what one sarcomere does? They all do the same thing. What's contained within those fibrils are filaments, alternating thick and thin, different proportions. And we have to look at the molecular composition, principally actin and myosin. Okay, so here's the individual fibril that we pull out, and we're going to stop here because I can't wait to do that. A bands, I bands, and Z discs. So I know you could curtail your excitement until Wednesday. Anybody looking at an upset in the NFL this weekend?